tonight, the event that you've all been waiting for. This is Kimberly Rios, an associate professor in psychology, and she's going to talk to us about perceptions of science and religion. It's all yours.
Well, good evening. Thank you, everybody, for braving this somewhat dicey weather and the topic and actually showing up. I know this is a really controversial topic, so I wanted to start off with a few disclaimers that I don't have in this discussion, presentation, an agenda based on my own religious or political beliefs, whatever they may be. But I am going to be asking some opinions and questions of you. Some of these might be somewhat controversial, but the point of these interactions is not to establish who or what is right versus wrong, but rather to get everybody on the same page about what the norms and average beliefs are in society about these topics related to religion and science. So with that in mind, I have an opening question. This is kind of a test, but don't worry. There is a right answer, but I don't expect any of you to nail it. You're not supposed to look this up on Google, but presumably, hopefully everybody here knows that the Earth revolves around the sun. But what percentage of Americans do you think believes that the sun revolves around the Earth? Somebody said 20%. 75? 35? 6? 7%? 20? Okay, all within the ballpark, actually. The correct answer is actually 26%, so just over a quarter of Americans who believe that the sun revolves around the Earth. Now, how about the percentage of Americans that correctly believe that the universe began with a huge explosion? Yes? 76? Anyone else? 20. Okay, again, somewhat in between. That is 39%. And compare that to 48% of Americans who believe that human beings developed from earlier species of animals. So these are all a wide range of statistics demonstrating basic knowledge and literacy of scientific topics. And so you know, the topic of today's discussion is perceptions and beliefs about science and religion and the relationship between the two. So one of the things that most consistently predicts scientific knowledge and literacy, so in other words, performance on tests and questions such as these, is a level of religiosity. So I want to say, first of all, that even though on the whole being religious is associated with lower performance on these sorts of questions, it really does depend on the type and the extremity of the religion that we're talking about. So just to show you a little bit of the data from the 2006 General Social Survey. So this is a mass survey of thousands of Americans. This varies quite a bit in terms of people's type and form of religiosity. So this is a percentage correct on a 13-question test that has all three of the questions I showed you on the previous slide about the Big Bang, the sun and the earth, and evolution, and the percentage of Americans who get these questions correct, who fall under these different categories. So people who report no religious affiliation, although they perform the best on average, really varies between denominations of religions. So sectarian Protestants, basically non-mainline Protestants, say Church of Christ, Nazarene, religions like that tend to perform the lowest, with mainline Protestants and non-Christian religions somewhere in between. And similarly, if you look at the right-hand side, the right-hand graph, those who take the Bible literally, word for word, tend to exhibit lower performance than religious people who don't, as well as people who just think that the Bible is a book of fables or whatever scripture one's religion adheres to. So this is just a little bit of an illustration that even though there are general trends in terms of religiosity and scientific literacy, it really depends on the kind of religiosity we're talking about here. And also the reasons why this might be the case. So why might we see these differences in scientific literacy among religious versus non-religious people? And why might there be differences on other sorts of scientific outcomes? That's really going to be the focus of my talk, not looking at, who's most scientifically literate and who is least so. We're really going to probe the why of this. So just to give you a little bit more background and context on the topic, the research that I've been pursuing for the last 5 years or so, religious attendance and strength of religious beliefs, in addition to being associated with somewhat less science knowledge on these sorts of questions, is associated also with a little bit more distrust of science and less willingness to support and fund scientific research of different kinds. And this is true even after you take into account any differences between, say, education level, political views, anything like that. So really, religiosity pops out as one of the main determinants of how people are going to feel about and whether they are going to trust science. And also, religious people, relative to their proportion in the US population at least, tend to be sorely underrepresented in scientific disciplines among faculty and students. And this is true with both the natural sciences, like biology and chemistry, and the social sciences, like psychology, anthropology, and so forth. So just to give you some statistics and background on this, let me ask you actually, what percentage of Americans do you think believe in God? Yes? 36? 98? 60? 70? Oh, 70, okay. So it's about 90%, maybe a little bit more, and the vast majority in the US identify themselves as Christian, but of course there are other denominations too, and toward the end of my discussion, I'm going to gear it more towards that. So even though over 90% of Americans report believing in God, that percentage, when you consider faculty of natural and social sciences at elite four-year universities, that percentage drops to 25%. And when you consider what some people think of as the elite, so members of the National Academy of Sciences, really prestigious society that you basically have to be the best thing ever in your field to be elected to, that percentage, as of 1998, was about 7%. Only 7% of members of those societies believed in God. And given the rise in secularism across the past couple of decades, I would bet that that percentage is probably even lower now. So one of the driving questions of my research program has been, why is this the case? Why are religious individuals, specifically I'll focus here on Christians since they're the vast religious majority, so underrepresented in scientific disciplines? So this is a bit of a hot button question, but I'm going to take a risk here by asking you what you think. What are some possible reasons that religious people might choose to pursue science less than non-religious people? Yeah, challenges their belief system. Yes?
If you already don't believe science, why would you want to pursue, why would you see that as a worthwhile pursuit, I guess?
Right, so related to that, maybe questioning the value of science to you, to society. Yes?
Religious people believe they have all the answers they want, so science is useless for them. They could think.
Yeah, so the belief that as a religious person, I might already have the answers, so why pursue this? Mm-hmm. Yes? They don't feel like they belong? Mm-hmm.
It's a correlation thing, as if you're less rational, you're more likely to be religious, therefore less scientific.
Yeah, so a lot of potential differences in mode of thinking, whether you tend to think analytically or rationally versus rely more on your intuitions. Yes?
I think also just culturally, they're framed very oppositionally.
Yep, and that is going to be a huge part of my discussion a little bit later on. In fact, a lot of these answers that you all have brought up, virtually every answer that I've heard from all of you hits on some aspect of why religious people tend to be underrepresented in science. And my focus of the research that I've been conducting is on stereotypes, both of religious people and their scientific abilities, so stereotypes that non-religious people might have and how that might affect religious people's self-concepts and willingness to pursue science. And then also on the flip side, stereotypes that religious people might have about science itself. So these stereotypes go both ways and both create these gross discrepancies in what our national population looks like in terms of religious composition and what the population of scientists looks like. So in a previous work that's been conducted in this area, a lot of researchers have pointed to things like, well, religious people tend to think more intuitively, and science relies on analytical thinking. So this is a discrepancy between the faith-based intuition that we're often taught as religious individuals to embrace and the analytical reasoning that's required of science. And in fact, there was a really controversial meta-analysis. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it's basically this huge paper that compiles several, maybe hundreds of results from different studies about this topic. And this meta-analysis reported an overall negative relationship between religiosity and general intelligence. So they reported the more religious you are, the less intelligent you tend to be, as measured by a variety of intelligence tests. Now, I want to give you a caveat of these studies, which is that a lot of these intelligence measures were really focused on measures of analytical reasoning. So that was the bulk of what was actually reported in this analysis. So as I've just described, a lot of the previous reasons given for why religious people might not pursue science have to do with, oh, well, maybe these disciplines or these schools of thought are simply incompatible. And indeed, all I have to do anytime I give a presentation about these sorts of topics is do a Google image search for science versus religion or the conflict between religion and science, and there is no shortage of images, some of which are pretty funny, like these, that'll come up. So science and religion going in separate directions, one boxer telling the other not to hit below the Bible Belt, science versus religion in the ring, and Einstein having an arm wrestling match with Jesus, which Einstein actually did self-identify as Jewish, so this is funny in a couple of different ways. So one thing that I've become really fascinated with over the years is this notion that regardless of whether science and religion are actually in conflict or incompatible, I'll remain, pun very much intended, agnostic about that. One of the things that I've really focused on is this perception in Western society that science and religion, especially Christianity, cannot and do not go together. So some examples, other than these Google images and popular culture that several of you might be familiar with. Who all is familiar with Richard Dawkins? Yeah, so he's very outspoken biologist, self-identifies as atheist, and often is quoted as saying very extreme things about religion or about religious people and their relationship with science. Who all here has heard of Francis Collins? Okay, a couple of you. Francis Collins was appointed by then President Obama as the head of NIH, and also identifies as Christian. And that was perhaps not surprisingly, given these societal perceptions of religion and science and compatibility, a pretty controversial decision that led to a lot of debates among Americans about whether a self-identified Christian person really should be chosen to head and represent this organization. So a lot of different stereotypes about the incompatibility about science and religion, are out there in popular culture and in society. And closely related, in fact, are stereotypes about religious people, and I'll focus for a minute here on Christians, who are the religious majority in the US, and about stereotypes about their scientific abilities. So when I first started doing this type of work, my colleagues and I set out to determine whether people really do have these stereotypes about religious people lacking in scientific ability and lacking in trust in science relative to other groups. So we did some surveys of adults who lived in the United States, and we asked them two things. First, to what extent do you think society believes that Christians or atheists, Jews, Muslims, a lot of other religious and non-religious groups are bad at science or distrusting of science? We asked about other traits too, but the science-related traits are really what we were interested in. Then we asked them, to what extent do you personally believe that Christians, atheists, etc., are bad at science? And we varied the order of these questions, so nobody was influenced in particular by one of them especially. And we actually found that, so we separated the results between Christians and non-Christians, and we found that for this awareness of the social stereotypes of religious people, specifically Christian scientific abilities, both Christian and non-Christian participants recognized that Christians are stereotyped and thought to be inferior with respect to their scientific abilities. But when it comes to personal beliefs about personal endorsement of the stereotypes of religion and science, there was a huge discrepancy between Christian and non-Christian participants. Christians didn't see themselves or their own group as any worse or less trusting of science than zero, which is the average person, whereas non-Christians were perfectly willing to endorse this stereotype and say, yes, I do believe that Christians are bad at science, and I do believe Christians don't trust science. And I found this result really striking because in an era where we are not supposed to express our stereotypes and prejudices, where it's really important to be politically correct, a lot of people are openly endorsing a negative stereotype about a group. And just as a stark contrast, my collaborators and I ran another study where we essentially replaced all these religious groups, stereotypes of them, with men and women. And we found a very different pattern of results. So everybody recognized women are stereotyped as bad at science. But nobody was willing to openly admit, neither men nor women, that women were worse at science. But people seem perfectly comfortable admitting to holding this stereotype themselves about Christians if they're not Christians. And this doesn't hold true for any other religious group. People don't stereotype Jewish individuals this way or Muslim individuals. And if anything, stereotypes about atheists, who are often associated with science, run in the opposite direction, where they're perceived as being better at science by everybody. So those are just some starting points for how and why we decided to conduct this line of research to begin with. And we were really interested in, regardless of whether these stereotypes are actually true, how much validity they have, how do This awareness of the stereotypes about Christian scientific abilities, as well as stereotypes of the incompatibility between Christianity and science, affect performance on scientific tasks or ultimate willingness to pursue scientific fields of study. So I've shown, in short, evidence for both of these things. And what's important is that this is, Christians themselves really do not endorse the stereotype, and it's not that Christians are inherently not disinterested or unidentified with science. It really is, at least in part, about what society thinks that their capabilities are or relationship with science and their religious faith that lead to these differences that we often see in scientific performance or an interest in pursuit of science. Yeah?
With these same data, were you able to look at, like, if atheists or Muslims, for example, self-identified with the stereotype of not being warm?
Yeah, so in this particular study, we didn't have. Oh, sorry. Okay, so you asked whether in this study what I was able to look at whether atheists and Muslims self-stereotyped as being less warm than other groups. And unfortunately, in this study, I didn't have enough atheist or Muslim participants. So non-Christians were, just for the purposes of increasing power, which is ability to detect effects in the first place, grouped together. And Christians were analyzed separately from them. But I do have other data. I have research with a graduate student of mine who's here, but a couple graduate students I won't embarrass, that look at whether atheists are affected by stereotypes about their group. And in some cases, when atheists are reminded of stereotypes, that they're cold and immoral, they actually behave more pro-socially and more generously in order to sort of compensate and counteract those stereotypes that people have. So it's a really excellent question, and we're on it. Any other questions before I go on? Yeah?
So you mentioned Francis Collins, who is a very good biologist, and these people basically redefine the religion for themselves. So if you look at the writings of Francis Collins, he believes in evolution, he believes in a lot of things, but still he defines himself as Christian. So there has to be some distinction between Francis Collins and another person who believes on every religion.
Yeah, so this gentleman asked how we distinguish Francis Collins, who's an avid believer in evolution and other scientific ideas, from other sorts of Christians. And I do think that it's an important question in that there are range of differences within Christians about the extent to which they endorse science, how interested they are in science, and Francis Collins would obviously be a case of somebody who's really pro-science. But that said, I mean, even though there are other maybe types of Christians, like the graphs I showed at the beginning, where biblical literalists and non-mainline Protestants tend to be less scientifically literate than, say, mainline Protestants. There are some differences, but the important thing really is that this is one, I'm not saying that stereotypes are the only thing that affects Christians' performance and willingness to pursue science, but it is one thing. So even apart from all these differences within Christians, that these stereotypes that people might have of Christians in general are pretty pervasive and have potentially nefarious consequences. So thanks for that question. So in terms of,
I'm curious about the language that's used in some of these stories. I mean, if you ask somebody if they believe science, almost everybody's going to say yeah. But then as soon as you work in terms like climate change and evolution, that same person may say no, not so much. So, I mean, how much are those terms taken into consideration when you study?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So he asked whether...
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, so he asked whether people are, whether depending on the way that the question is worded, so whether it's, do you like science or trust science, or do you believe in evolution, do you believe in climate change, these more specific issues, whether there are any differences in responses to those sorts of questions. And that's a really good question. In the studies that have been conducted, there's been a range of different types of questions that have been asked. So some will ask about general trust in the scientific community. Just say, I trust the scientific community. I think scientific research should get more funding. Things like that that don't point to a specific issue. And then there are the really issue-specific questions that you pointed to. And across all of those, probably more so on the issue-specific questions, you do find differences in trust in science. Yeah?
I know you said it was like mostly adults, but do you think like age came into it, whereas like older generations, Catholic Church kind of taught that to go, now younger generations are going more like to believe more towards science? Like I know it's like there's Catholic Church is teaching specifically. Do you think age changes that at all?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. You asked whether there are any generational or age differences in these sorts of effects. And I would say that on one hand, yes. So I think there was a recent article in Slate magazine that talked a lot about how belief in evolution is on the rise, so among these younger generations. But on the other hand, as long as these stereotypes, negative stereotypes about Christians and about religious people persist in society, we will have some of these differences in willingness to pursue science and performance. So a little bit of both. Yes?
Is there also, in terms of Catholic belief, Teilhard de Chardin, Mendel's experiments in the 1880s, etc., there's been a long tradition of Catholic, I think he called it himself, of Catholic love of evolution. The one problem, however, is that sometimes Protestants, saying's always one, who contribute to Nobel Prize stuff, like the guy who invented the Armenian biblical literalist believer who invented the MRI, Avery, who discovered the role of DNA, and his father played trumpet to get into his sermons in New York City. But those are two people, the Swedes share some of these prejudices, I suspect. That's all. Do they? Or has it been studied with other countries, their attitudes toward different types of Christians?
So other countries' attitudes toward different types of Christians? Yeah, so there has been some research on, so he asked whether other countries differ in their perceptions of Christians, and there is some research on how perceptions of religion and science in general differ across countries. And I'll get to some of that at the end. So in non-Western religious and cultural contexts, minor spoiler alert, these sorts of results and effects do look really different. And certainly in countries, in Western European countries like the UK that are mostly very secular, you do see, perhaps even more pronounced negative stereotypes of religious people, but maybe not as many stereotypes about, say, atheists or non-believers. Mm-hmm.
So, like you say, like stereotypes are like the main reason why Christians like are getting into.
Well, I wouldn't say the main reason, but one.
Okay. Well, I mean, but also like women have also like historically there's been a lot of stereotypes against women, and like obviously there's been a lot of like campaigning about getting young girls into STEM.
Yeah.
So like, do you think any of these similar campaigns for Christians are going to be like as effective?
So this woman asked whether campaigns similar to increasing women's participation in STEM to increase Christians' participation and interest in science would be similarly effective. And I think I mean, it's complicated. I haven't gotten to the point where I've tried such interventions yet, although I really want to at some point in the near future. And I think that even though these interventions, given the role of stereotypes, can have effects that might parallel some effects you would see with women in STEM, you would have to be pretty careful about how these interventions are implemented and among whom. As I showed you at the beginning, even within Christian religions, there can be a variety of different beliefs represented about science. And so depends on the type of population you're working with. But that's a really good question. Thank you. So just to briefly give you a little bit of background about some of my research, I will spare you a lot of the very technical nitty-gritty details. For that, if you really want to read one of my papers to help you fall asleep at night, you can. So what I've found in a variety of studies that I've conducted with both Christian and non-Christian participants, and these are both college students as well as adults, I found that when Christians and non-Christians are told or reminded of the negative stereotypes about Christians in science, or about stereotypes of the incompatibility between religion and science, that you do see performance differences on tasks that are designed to measure scientific reasoning. But then, when you take randomly half of these participants and tell them instead, no, there's evidence that religion and science are compatible, or Christians don't differ in their scientific abilities relative to non-Christians. So if you dispel these stereotypes, then there is no difference between Christian and non-Christian participants in terms of how they perform on these tasks. So the important thing is that there's nothing different about any of these studies except for the information that people are given in the beginning that either reminds them about the existence of these stereotypes, or either doesn't remind them or actively dispels the stereotypes. So even though, as many of you have pointed out, there's multiple reasons why we might see performance and interest discrepancies between Christians and non-Christians, just varying a little bit of language about these stereotypes or a little bit of the context can make a big difference for some of these participants. So a couple of examples of things that I've done in the past. In addition to telling people overtly in our previous research, Christians had been shown to perform worse than non-Christians and express less interest in science, versus they perform just as well and express just as much interest. So that's the most basic type of information that I could give people. Even just varying how we describe the nature of the task that participants are completing on which their performance is assessed is enough to elicit these stereotypes. So for example, in one study that I conducted, I gave people the exact same test to take, but I told half of them that the test was a scientific reasoning test. So if the stereotype, as I argue, of religious people in science really is prevalent and pervasive, then even giving just that description of a task as measuring scientific reasoning should be somewhat threatening. But for the other half of the participants, I told them, exact same task, this is a measure of intuitive thinking. So again, these tasks did not differ except for the description of the task that they were given. And when the task was described as scientific reasoning, Christians and non-Christians demonstrated a discrepancy in performance, with Christians underperforming relative to the non-Christians. But then, when it was described as an intuitive thought task, there were no differences between groups, even though the task was the same. So just to give you a little bit of background on how scientific performance is measured, since some of you might be curious, we stayed away from tasks like does the sun revolve around the earth or does the earth revolve around the sun? Because we didn't want to run into issues with different subjects having pre-existing differences in their science knowledge or types of courses and professional backgrounds that they had. So we picked these tasks that could easily be described to participants as measuring scientific reasoning and indeed involved some analytical thinking, but that a lot of people, regardless of educational background, could perform well on. So a couple of examples of this. One task that I've used extensively is known in the world of psychology researchers as the RAT, or the Remote Associates Test. What you do here is, and I'm going to quiz you guys in a second, you are given a list of 3 words, and your job is to figure out which is the 4th word that's related to the 3 words that you were given. So let's start out with a relatively easy one. This is cream, skate, and water. What's the 4th word? Ice. Okay, good. Now this is a slightly more difficult one. Fox, man, and peep. Pull. Okay, good. You guys are great. And there's the 3rd one, which is a little bit harder. Right, cat, and carbon. Sorry? Ghost. Although it's there's a ghost thing coming up. Copy. Okay, good. So these are examples of the kinds of problems that you might expect on a test like this. And there's another type of task that I've used that relies on what's called nonsense syllogisms. So you're given a set of statements and a conclusion, and even though these statements and conclusion are absurd, so they're nonsense on the face of it, you have to decide logically whether the conclusion follows from the 2 statements before. So in one of my favorites, and of course, I have to have the word cat on one of my slides twice because I love cats. No ghosts are electrified. All cats are electrified. Therefore, no ghost is a cat. So this is nonsense, obviously, but this set of premises and conclusions, actually, the conclusion does follow logically from the premises if you really think about it. And I do have an electrified ghost cat in my household. This is Stella. It's the first picture I ever took with my iPhone. It was like 8 years ago, and it came out kind of electrified. So again, all you have to do is do a Google image search for electrified ghost cat. If you're a cat lover, have fun with that, because I sure did. So those are just some ways that scientific performance has been assessed in the research that I've done. And again, stayed away from measures of scientific knowledge and actual tests you might have seen. You know, I didn't ask people for information about the periodic table or anything like that, because those sorts of results really could vary depending on the kind of education or training you've had. So does anybody have any questions at this point? Yes? That's a really good question. What's a stereotype? A stereotype is a perception of a group of people that is commonly held. And a stereotype can be, even though I've focused here on a negative stereotype about Christian people in science, there are examples of stereotypes that are positive. So for example, there's a widely held stereotype of Asian Americans as a model minority who tend to excel in math and other subjects. Again, stereotypes are often not true and they're inaccurate. Even positive ones can have negative consequences, but that's a subject for a whole different day. And another thing about these types of results that I've shown you is that the idea that negative stereotypes can influence the performance and interest of a particular group of people to go into a discipline like science, that's not a new idea in itself. So just as some background and context, there's a lot of work in my field, which is experimental social psychology, about stereotypes of women in scientific and math disciplines, and how when women are made to feel like they don't belong or they're outnumbered in science and math, they're less willing to pursue those disciplines and may exhibit similar performance decrements as Christians do in science. But the research that I conducted with my colleagues here was really the first example, or one of the first examples of stereotypes about a vast majority group in society, and how even majority group members can be negatively affected by these negative stereotypes. And plus, we see our contribution here, what we're trying to convey with these results, as really wanting to underscore the fact that it's, regardless of the truth of any of these stereotypes or perceptions of do religion and science really go together, that people's beliefs about religion and science, or about religious people in science, those beliefs themselves can have really profound effects. So just to get into a little bit some of my research on the reverse, so stereotypes that some religious people might have about science. A number of you asked, or when I asked you at the beginning of this discussion, why religious people might be underrepresented or unwilling to pursue science, a lot of you mentioned things about religious people maybe feeling like science is incompatible with their value system. And indeed, this is one other factor that my colleagues and I have shown can be at play. So for example, when religious people are given, specifically Christians, are given information that suggests that science is dominated by atheists and that atheists are really prevalent in science, they become less trusting of science in general. So even these very broad questions about trust in the scientific community, they score lower on when they're given information that science is primarily made up of atheists versus no information, or information that science is made up primarily of religious people. And we found that this is due not to negative stereotypes about atheists themselves, since there are many, but stereotypes of atheists as untrustworthy, as cold, etc. But it's really due to the perception that science is anti-religion and that science tries to impose its value system onto religious values. So in a sense, the perception that religion and science are in conflict goes both ways, and members of multiple groups, religious and non-religious, are capable of endorsing that. And just to give you a little bit of background, since we're running out of time here, but I wanted to touch on perceptions of religion and science beyond the US, since this is a growing area of interest for me. What really started my interest in this topic of religion and science and stereotypes in general was a trip that I took to Morocco about 6 years ago. It was a really formative trip for many reasons, including what's depicted here, but one of the main things that I took away was, in talking to people who lived there, some issues of religion and science came up. And I mentioned that a lot of people in the US tend to think religion and science don't or can't go together. And the people in Morocco that I discussed this with were pretty floored, and I was kind of shocked that they were shocked. And so I sort of started thinking about, well, can these different perceptions and stereotypes be culturally specific? Might it be something about how we perceive religion and science here that leads to these decrements in performance and interest among Christians in the US? We have some preliminary evidence. I'm collaborating now with a researcher who's in the United Arab Emirates on questions of religion and science, how college students perceive religion, science, and the relationship between the two of them. And we're conducting a year-long study of first-year college students at each of our respective universities. And we're looking at whether there are differences in people's perceptions across these two countries of whether religion and science are compatible. And it turns out there are in the United Arab Emirates as well as in other Muslim countries. People tend to think religion and science are more compatible than they do here. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper in this study that we're doing that's going on right now about why might this be the case? What is it about these differences in cultures and in religions that contribute to this? And just as an example, my colleague in the UAE has told me that at his institution, most science professors openly identify as religious. And it is, not something you would see very often in American or many Western societies, that you would have science professors that would be really candid about their religious backgrounds. If anything, they're candid about their lack of religious background here more often than not. So that's just some of where we're going next, and I'm really interested to take further questions from you and hear what you think about all this. Yeah. Oh, no, that's okay.
Has been involved in trying to map this difference between groups. I'm wondering if cognitive dissonance has played a role at all as a metric that's been studied. And I'm not very aware of the literature of the studies that have gone into it, but it strikes me that would be potentially another common metric that might be thrown out.
Yeah, so he asked whether cognitive dissonance can play a role potentially in these kinds of results. And for those of you who aren't familiar, cognitive dissonance is basically the idea that you have two conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, and because that's uncomfortable for a lot of people, you try to then resolve that dissonance by changing one or more of these attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And I do think, it is a separate theoretical perspective, but can be considered somewhat related, since if or to the extent that, say, religious people here perceive dissonance, if they kind of like science, but then they're not sure if science is compatible with their religious teachings, then they will have to resolve that conflict in some way or another. And that could also help to explain why, say, in Muslim and other non-Western societies and religious contexts, there's less of a perception of incompatibility between religion and science. I think, one of the simplest explanations is these members of these cultural cultures don't experience as much dissonance because, religion and science aren't seen as incompatible. Yes?
As far as in your study comparing UAE and the US, how would you factor in the separation of church and state in the constitutions of the countries? So, for example, over third has been long encouraged and tried in the constitution, whereas it might be different from country to country.
Oh, yeah. So you asked whether or how we're factoring in our study of comparing the U.S. to the UAE, a separation of church and state, and how that differs across the cultural context. We have, it's hard when you're doing a comparison between two countries to factor in all the possible ways that they could differ from one another, but to sort of get at what you're asking, we do ask questions about church and state and whether people in each cultural context believe that they should be kept separate. We ask about degree of religiosity, about political views, about different interpretations of the Bible, whether it should be interpreted literally versus not. So there are all sorts of questions that sort of get at what you're asking. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
Have you conducted any research for the compatibility of beliefs of first-year college students versus fourth year? So, like, when you come into college and then you're blasted with all of these different beliefs, and like your perceptions can change throughout the fourth year.
So she asked whether I've done any research on perceptions of compatibility between religion and science from the first year of college versus, say, the fourth year of college when your beliefs have changed. And short answer is we really, really want to do that study. So my colleague and I have talked about applying for additional funding to extend this survey that we're doing with first-year college students and to follow these participants from their first year to their fourth year, because we think while their attitudes and perceptions of religion, science, and their relationship might change over the course of 9 months from the beginning to the end of their first year, there's even more potential to see changes, as you said, in your fourth year. And in fact, there's some parallel research, really old classic study from the 1950s about how college students at Bennington, which is a small liberal arts school in Vermont, tend to become more liberal over time. That was one of the seminal studies on, on how political and other ideological beliefs can change as a result of the college experience. Yes?
Yes, my question is, so based on latest few research, millennials are getting less religious, 30% are religious. So do you think the United States is going to follow other OECD countries to become secular?
Can you repeat that question? Maybe speak up a little bit.
Yeah, so based on latest few research, millennials are getting less religious.
Yes.
Do you think the United States is following other OECD countries to become secular?
Organization of Economic Cooperation.
Yeah, so your question is the United States becoming more secular because millennials are becoming less religious? I think, well, yes and no. So on the one hand, there is a rise in secularism throughout the past couple of decades, especially. So there's been a rise in people who identify as atheists, agnostic, or nuns. And by nuns, I don't mean Catholic nuns. I mean religious, N-O-N-Es, like I'm not religious. But on the other hand, I think it would be a pretty long while before the U.S., if it ever happened, became totally secular, given the very overwhelming majority of people who report that they believe in God, and it's still upwards of 90%. So that it would be a long time coming, I would think, before before the U.S. leans toward being completely secular.
I'm not sure, but is he asking the question? He's got his hand raised.
He's trying. We're going to get to it.
Oh.
He's going to be our last question, at least immediately.
What's a Bible?
What's a Bible? A Bible is, well, it depends on who you ask at some level, but the most basic answer is that the Bible is the holy book that Christians use to guide their faith, just like the Torah for Jewish people and the Quran for Muslims. So a lot of religion, most if not all religions, have their holy book or set of scriptures that they follow, and the Bible is that for Christians.
So let's thank him.
Thank you.